what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about an interesting problem. I haven't done any sophisticated modelling. I've got some ideas for modelling, so I'm going to spend 10 minutes kind of setting the scene and introducing the problem and why we'd like to think about it, and then talk about some of the ideas and the sort of motivation for the kind of models that I'd like to look at. Hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I do, because I think it's an engaging kind of topic. So, okay, so the plan of the talk, some motivation. This is going to be like about 10 minutes, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I'll skip through the review of existing work very fast, and then talk about some modelling strategies and just show you very briefly at the end, hopefully, some very preliminary findings which kind of help us to assess the modelling ideas as potential candidates. So what I want to think about is the duration, or the different durations over which heavy rain might cause problems, and the fact that we can distinguish between those. So there are very different time windows over which heavy rainfall can be a problem. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. So the first one is thinking about rainfall of the order of a day or more. So these are floods. This was Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire, I think, which had 2 consecutive years of, this is the area around the Abbey which got cut off. And the reason for this was because there was very heavy rainfall occurring over the timescale of the order of a day or more. There were several days of heavy rain leading up to a particularly heavy day of rain. Okay, so this kind of damage, that kind of event, could be modelled by using standard models for extremes of daily aggregate rainfall. Okay, so they'd be appropriate for modelling those kind of events. Now, this next event was one that I experienced. This was Newcastle upon Tyne in 2012. I'm not sure how well that slide's coming out, but this was 3 or 4 p.m. in the afternoon in the middle of summer, and it really did look like this. And this was before the rain started, and it was an extraordinary event. And so, after the darkness, the rain hit, things lightened up a bit, and this was flooding that occurred over the time scale was of the order of an hour. So we actually had 2 hours of heavy rain. We kind of had what I would think of as sort of moderate level flooding, so this kind of thing. We saw the metro stop, the buses stopped, the roads were gridlocked. So there were no deaths, the level of destruction wasn't as severe as we're about to see in the next example. But I think, for example, one of my work colleagues took 8 hours to get home, and it was a 3-mile journey because he had the car and he had to get the car home, and there was complete gridlock and so on. And then this is taken very close to where I live now. So when this storm actually happened, I lived in a nice, safe, high part of Newcastle, and then, as you do, the year afterwards, I moved right over to where there'd been some of the worst flooding. And when we moved to that area, so we were being shown around the house by a young doctor there who was on nights, and he said he was very confused because he woke up, he thought it could be the daytime, it was completely dark, and then he looked down our little side street to the main road, and he saw people canoeing down the road, and he thought he must be dreaming. So we had this event, and my attitude to that was, well, if the flood was that bad and this house didn't get inundated, this is probably okay. So we weren't put off moving there. One other thing that struck me, this isn't a very urban area with lots of terraced houses and so on. I don't really know who all these people are. They just have their canoes ready for when the street floods. Okay, so this was what was called a supercell storm, I'm told. It struck pretty much without warning. The heavy rainfall duration, I say it was the order of an hour. I think it was 2 hours. So models for extremes of hourly aggregate rainfall would be appropriate for estimating the probabilities of something like that happening. But an analysis based on daily aggregate rainfall would probably miss that, because although that was a day of heavy rain, the rain was really concentrated in an hour or two, and it's that we're interested in. If that rainfall had been spread throughout the whole day, it probably wouldn't have been a problem. And then in between, this is a severe event, which is a more severe event, which was caused by something in between. So it rained harder than it did in Newcastle, but it did it for about 8 hours. So Boscastle 2004, you can see the level of destruction. No deaths again, although lots of people needed to be rescued from trees and so on. So this kind of thing. So just let you see that a little bit longer. So this event was from rain that fell in for a period with a duration in between. So it rained very hard for about 8 hours. Okay? So one of the most severe floods ever recorded in the UK, and the timescale fell somewhere in between the daily and the hourly level. Okay? So basically, I think there's quite a lot of slightly too wordy paragraphs in this talk, but what this is saying is if we were to use models for either hourly events or based on either hourly aggregate rainfall or daily aggregate rainfall, we wouldn't capture the full severity of an event like this if we think of it over the duration that it actually happened. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is motivate the idea that we need to think about it matters the timescale over which the rainfall falls, obviously, but we'd like to think about how can we jointly make inferences on such things. So the different time windows over which we get extreme rain can be important, and they drive this need to characterise the extreme rain climate over multiple time aggregations. So the depth, duration, frequency curve represents this idea by thinking about return levels for several different time aggregations on the same graph. So here is one that was produced by a student of mine. I couldn't get one to come out quite as nicely quickly, so I'm using this one. So what this actually, these are return levels. This is for hourly rainfall, 6 hourly rainfall, daily rainfall, i.e. 24 hourly durations. Just simply fitted, extreme value models fitted to the data that we've got independently, okay, which isn't the correct way of capturing everything that's going on, but is sufficient for illustrating this graph. So down here we've got return period, we've got these three separate curves, and here we've got return level. If you divide these numbers by 10, that will be the return level in millimetres. It's because the data is recorded in tenths of a millimetre. So a depth, duration, frequency curve would be the continuum of curves, of these return level curves, as we move over all of these durations. That's the way I'd like to think about it. So what we always actually see is some duration sampled from that. Here we've got these three. And there's no uncertainties represented on here. Of course, that's a whole other issue. We could put uncertainty bands on these curves. But of course, when you've got more than one curve, that rapidly becomes a bit too complicated to kind of visualize. Okay. So it can be important to have access to return level estimates for extremes, any of these durations, and of course durations outside of these levels that we're talking about. People sometimes are interested in rainfall aggregates for as little time as 1 minute or as long as a month. You see these analyses. But if hourly data are available, so let's just think between, for our purposes, the shortest duration we're interested in is an hour and the longest is a day. If hourly data are available, then we can directly construct data for use over any aggregation of d hours. Okay? And the only issue there for the analysis, well, one of the issues for the analysis is whether or not we use a fixed window or a sliding window for aggregation. So this is somebody else's graph. They've referred to this as rainfall intensity. I think because it's been blocked into hours, I think we can interpret this as the aggregation, heights of these bars of the aggregation, the amount of rain that fell in each hour. So you see we've got one extreme hour here, but if we're thinking about modelling the daily data based on this, well, if we've just got access to daily totals recorded by calendar days, we just have to use the total here. Whereas you can imagine if we actually think about what's the most extreme 24 hours, then we'd have to think about sliding this along, and we'd get something that was going to be more extreme than the total there. I'll show you another example of that a bit later. Okay. So, it's much more common that data are only available as daily rainfall totals. So if we have hourly values, we can make inferences about hours, and we can make inferences about days, or 6 hours, or 8 hours, or whatever we want. But if we just have daily totals, then we've got a problem if we're wanting to make inferences about any shorter duration. We've got an inverse problem, if you like. Okay? So how do we disaggregate from days to hours? The ultimate aim of this work is to try and improve the estimation of return levels for sub-daily aggregations, especially hourly, when only daily data are available. Okay, so this is the approach to the talk. So the work strategy as a whole, I suppose. But so going to think about, there's lots of kind of references to find and background to this, which I had a good look at, so I'm going to very briefly skip through some of that. So one point to make is there's clearly dependence across different time aggregations, and that needs to be taken into account when we're modelling and so on. What am I saying here? Yes, so this is just some terminology, so I'm going to refer to the duration as the amount of time we're aggregating over, and the period is the return period that we're interested in, just so that I don't have to keep spelling those out. And we're focusing on DDF curves, thinking about this at a point, the amount of rain falling at a point over different aggregations. Sometimes people extend this to think of areas, DDAF curves. And a lot of people think in terms of the intensity. So instead of expressing the amount of rain that's fallen, it's expressed as the amount of rain that's fallen per hour, say. But obviously it's easy to convert between these IDF and DDF ideas. And the key feature about this work is that the availability of some data from the group based in Newcastle, the civil engineering group, so Hayley Fowler and her co-workers. And so there's a research initiative called Convex, and they're producing or they're quality controlling large amounts of hourly data, which is going to be very good for me, for example, to try and build sensible models. So we've got several hundred sites for which we've got of the order of 20 years of quality controlled hourly data. Okay, now, but despite that, I'm sure that the ability to make inference for hourly extremes based on daily data is still something that will be very much in demand generally, and so that's the motivation for this work. Okay, so just briefly, I'm going to go through some of the ideas of work that's been done in the area, and just consider some modelling strategies, and just look at some preliminary results at the end. So looking at profiles of daily rainfall, we saw one just now, and it helps to focus on the nature of the problem. So here's one. This is one of mine. So this is one from the data that I'm using. So this is in northwest England, and this is quite typical of a day when there's extreme rain. So we've got 2 hours here with a lot of rain. So Dame Julia Slingo was talking about 10 millimetres of rain in 6 hours being a lot. So what we're seeing here is about 25 millimetres of rain in 1 hour. Okay, so this is very much a lot. So what we see in a day when we get extreme rainfall is we get some hours where we get extremes. We get other hours where we get sub-extreme rainfall. Excuse me. And we typically would always get, well, usually a few hours where it's not raining. Okay? So it's quite a complex situation building up to the daily total rainfall. Okay. So we can think of extremes of daily rainfall as being thought of as a rising of sums of observations in clusters of extreme hourly observations as a very first approximation. But because clusters typically contain a mixture of hours with extreme rainfall, hours with non-extreme, and also hours with no rainfall, the situation's actually quite a lot more complicated. Okay, but it's so I started by thinking about the work on clusters of extremes and sums and averages thereof. So there's quite a lot of papers. I'm going to flick through just a few. So there's quite a lot of theoretical work focusing on extremes and moving averages. So let's flick through these things looking at point processes and limits for the sums, severity of extreme events. So Clive Anderson and one of his students looked at the severity of an event as the sum of the exceedances over its threshold. Okay? And various other work along those lines. So that work is potentially applicable to clustering behaviours, the clustering behaviour of extremes if we think of them as in a pure sense. But it's difficult to see directly how to apply that to something as complicated as a day's rainfall, where we get this mixture of different things going on. And then at the opposite end of the kind of theoretical scale, there's lots of pragmatic work looking at DDF curves and IDF curves. So you can find IDF curves for a few hundred, well, more than 100 stations in the United States in a catalogue available from 1955. But then the serious statistical work that doesn't rely on, isn't purely based on looking at clustering of extreme events, is all much later, so starting in the late 90s. Okay, so there's various papers there. I'm going to flick through them. So the ones that I want to focus on are this team, Overeem, Boyshand and Holloman, and I think it was work by Patrick Boyshand that first kind of sort of made me look at this problem and think about it. So they started modelling GV parameters as a function of the duration, okay, the time aggregation window, after combining data over many sites where they basically said, well, these don't differ significantly from each other, so we're just going to pool the data. Okay, and they had another paper the following year where they were using radar data, which is quite an interesting way of actually getting the data to use. So they were using these radar estimates to construct these BBF curves and their uncertainties. And then the last paper I wanted to mention was one of the ones that Jonathan was using. So the Winter and Torn paper uses this idea that Jonathan's just been talking about, which is potentially relevant to us. Okay? So the idea of a conditionally extremes approach with thinking about the amount of rain that falls in 1 hour and the next hour as a bivariate observation, and modelling that and using this idea of a Markov property, or as John just said in the answer to my question, we can go beyond we can go to the high order levels, and we'll see that it looks as though the Markov property, like Jonathan's situation, is kind of okay up to a point. Okay, so some suggested modelling strategies. So the starting one, we're considering the Overeem et al. Approach. And so they proposed a regression model. So here, theta could be one of the generalised extreme value distribution parameters, mu, sigma, psi, which we've seen talked about. So if, for example, it was mu, theta then would be a vector of mu's, one corresponding to each of the durations that we're looking at. Okay, so they propose this regression model where they'd say basically we have a simple, we'd have a beta for each parameter, and that just tells us, it gives us a simple linear regression to relate the parameter to the log of the duration. So this is kind of a sort of an ad hoc model that seems to work quite well. And the components of the error vector are of course correlated, because there's correlation between the estimates of the parameter, each of these extreme value parameters across the durations. So they need to take account of that. So they use generalized least squares to estimate the regression coefficients. Okay, and they reparameterize. This works quite well for them if they use log mu, sigma over mu, psi. And what they find, okay, so the GLS estimate is given by that, and there's an expression for the covariance. So what they find is this approach works quite well for their data, and they find that log mu and sigma over mu appear to be linearly increasing and decreasing with log of duration respectively, while psi doesn't appear to be changing much. So, fairly ad hoc relationship between GV parameters and duration, and we'd like to try approaches which avoid that. So here's a second suggestion. So work with Jonathan Attia and myself, we built a hierarchical model for extreme rainfall at multiple sites. So this is a little bit like the model that, say, Theo was talking about, for those of you that were in the first talk this morning. So here we've got models for the GEV parameters, mu, log of sigma, and psi, based on a covariate. In this case, the covariate we used that worked really well was the mean rainfall, the daily mean rainfall at a site, and we found that we were able to use this. This is actually a simplified version of what we used to kind of to allow our parameters to vary for sites within a region. So what we actually did, we had a covariate we had a time covariate for non-stationarity, and we had regional random effects to allow the differences between regions, and we had a dependence model. We actually used a Gaussian copula for the dependence across sites within a region. But just forgetting about the time aspect, the variation between regions, and the dependence for a second, what we had above was just our basic building block here. So how are we going to extend this to think about, suppose I'm focusing on hourly and daily rainfall, and we're going to focus on extending that. So if we think about this idea, we consider the bivariate pair, which is the largest, the hour with the largest rainfall, the amount of rainfall that falls there, and then the total rainfall that falls in the rest of the day. Okay? So So how about thinking about that as a bivariate extreme value observation and allowing those, then building those kind of hierarchical model ideas with covariates and so on to model that. So it helps to think about, again, this is, you saw this before, this is a rain profile. There's another one coming up, which I like. Oh, okay, well, I think this was just, the idea of this was just to illustrate that we consider this would be one component of our bivariate observation, and the other component would be the sum of all of the rest of those bars, and we'd like to think perhaps that that would be amenable to some bivariate extreme value modelling. We could use a parametric model, excuse me, voice is going. We could use a parametric model, or we could use something like the conditional extremes approach that John was talking about. Okay, so this has some advantages that you know, the hourly and daily durations then arrive naturally as y plus z, and we don't need to think about the detailed behaviour of the non-peak hour rainfall within the rest of the day. Okay, hopefully we can just allow that to sort itself out. Hopefully the model will be a reasonably good approximation of the truth. So these are things I'd like to try. And whatever model we choose, so parametric or semi-parametric models and so on, we're going to incorporate temporal and regional variations in the parameters, etc. Right, so then there's an additional layer of complexity coming in here because actually there would be dependence in these bivariate pairs as we went around from as we think about different sites in the region, and that would add a whole extra layer of complexity. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to show you this. This was a very extreme event. So this would have been nice. This is the 24th and 25th of December at a place with a station called Spade. And these were the hourly rainfalls. So almost 70 millimetres an hour on Christmas Eve. And then a quiet period. And then another very extreme event here. So we would have missed the full extremity of this event if we just had calendar days. But if we had a 24-hour window which contains both of those events, then we would capture that. Okay, and the last approach really, and I can say this quite quickly, just to adapt the methods of winter and Torn that we saw just now, to think about how we could do that, because it's not going to be directly applicable. Think about modelling the joint distribution of, so these are meant to represent the transformation, for example, to Laplace margins, the joint distribution at time t and time t plus 1. Okay? So the problem with that is that we've got a complicated situation, much more complicated than the heat wave one, because some of the observations are extreme, some of the observations are large but perhaps not extreme. That on its own isn't necessarily a problem, but some of the observations within a cluster will definitely be well below any threshold that we're going to use, because some of them are likely to be zero. Okay, so we probably can't simplify things. We can't think of it as quite such a simple structure. Suppose we want to start simulating some of these clusters as Jonathan and Eva did. So, three underlying states to consider. Simulation based on transitioning between states within a different, between these states sounds far too complicated for me, and I would look for kind of simplifications. So, for example, thinking about the number of excursions in a storm being a random variable and simulating from that number of storms. Okay, so if we could achieve a suitable simulation strategy for hourly rainfall, which captures the behaviour of long durations reasonably well, then potentially we can use the same ideas. Okay, just very quickly, just I wasn't quite sure what to show you with. So these are regional fits of shape parameters when we fit to different durations, finding really what other authors have suggested, but we don't really see much of a change. Positive shape parameters, but not really systematically changing the duration. This is a plot of the rainfall in the peak hour against the rainfall from the rest of the day, just to give us an idea about what kind of models we might use for that bivariate observation. So, clearly dependence, possibly decaying to independence as we go out. And lastly, a partial autocorrelation function from the same place, just showing that to an approximation the first order, the Markov property is okay, but there's clearly some correlation beyond that, as you'd expect if you think about rainfall. Okay, that's it. Apologies for my voice, but no, that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for listening.
Right, okay, before lunch, any questions for David? Yeah, silence.
I suppose I have a slight concern that in the daily values you've probably got a mixture of processes which generate your streams, which will each have their own characteristics. Whereas in the hourly, you're probably only sampling convective storms. And so there's some of that spread there is because you're mixing two different distributions together.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that there would actually be a mixture of types of extremes in addition to having...
Well, a mixture of physical processes.
Yeah, different processes giving rise.
Each one will have its own characteristics.
Okay.
That might give some explanation of why that is such a broad distribution between hourly and daily.
I suppose I just put that down to the fact that there's so many non-extreme hours in a day when there, or perhaps even 0 hours in a day when there are extreme hours. But yes, I mean that's an additional complexity which isn't something that I thought about, but it's kind of clear when you say it. Whether or not it would help to actually separately think about it. Given, I mean, it's probably a less of a distortion, if you like, if that's than the fact that we already have this mixture of of non-extreme events coming in the day as well. So.
Time perhaps for one final question before lunch, if anyone has one.
Well, it's sort of on that point. Clearly, if you want to extrapolate, you need to have the shape parameter always to be the same,
Yes.
don't you? Because otherwise, at some point, there's got to be an ordering on the other parameters, but the shape parameter's got to be the same. Otherwise, at some point, you'll be predicting lower values for hourly extremes than you would for 10-minute ones. But if you've got different processes at work, you could imagine that the shape parameters might not be the same. And then how you mix those two elements in, I have no idea. But perhaps, do you have some idea?
No, not really, but it's